how are you?
Hi, good, good. And can you let me know who I'm talking to?
Of course, yeah. My name is Victoria. I'm a first year and I'm really excited to be able to conduct this interview. I'm very passionate about like these topics, so I'm very excited.
Excellent. It's great to meet you, Victoria. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm Elizabeth. I'm a third year and I'm just kind of here to help out and just really learn some stuff I didn't really know before.
Very cool. Okay, well, what types of questions can I answer for you this morning?
Of course, yeah. So first of all, we always want to get to know you a little bit more, so this can be more of like a conversation. Um, so we have some background information about you. We saw that you wrote a great book, which to me was interesting. I love reading, and can you tell us a little bit more about your work? I would love to hear some more about that, just to get you to know you.
Well, currently I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. And I've been a history professor now for about 20, almost 23 years. It seems so amazing. And I have also this year, I'm the visiting humanities scholar, Hess scholar at Brooklyn College. I give a lot of talks about uh, African American and Latino history, social movements. I do a lot of Hispanic Heritage keynote lectures. Just coming out of Hispanic Heritage Month, that's where kind of my thought process is. Increasingly, you know, I've always spoken to student organizations, universities, unions, but increasingly in the past few years, especially since the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, I've been speaking a lot to corporations. And I did the Hispanic Heritage keynote for Wells Fargo International earlier in the month. I've done Hispanic Heritage keynotes for Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Microsoft, Guggenheim Partners, a lot of different. It's interesting because I'm so excited now that in some ways Latino history is catching up to Black history. We've always been very a close relationship. And my research, my main, I guess my most popular best-selling book is an African American and Latinx history of the United States. And so I've always seen those histories as really conjoined. But it's exciting now to see Latino history, you know, kind of catch up and really become more popular. So that's essentially what I do. I was president of the United Faculty of Florida. It's AFL-CIO labor union. I was the president of that for 3 years. I've always been active in the union as a faculty member to defend our intellectual freedom in Florida. It's always under siege. We're often led by people who talk about freedom in other countries, how they want to bring freedom to Latin America, to Africa, to the Middle East, and yet in the context they actually have control over, they would prefer to squelch intellectual freedom to get us to agree with what they have to say. So yeah, I've been very active. I'm sure you can see my name around here, there, and everywhere. The joke around here, you know, I was co-chair of the presidential task force at UF on African and Native American history, and I was asked to write the introduction to that report. And I think it's a really important report, and it goes from the history of UF and our antecedents from 1853 to present about specifically Native and African American histories. And when it came time to write the introduction, the task force, which consisted of administrators, alumni, students, faculty, said, well, let's ask Paul to write the introduction. He really doesn't have any more bridges to burn. And so he won't mind doing it. And in fact, it was a pleasure to do it. I was really proud of our students for really pushing the creation of that report and again, it's great to talk about freedom and democracy in other countries and other hemispheres, and it's great to talk about equality all over the world. But what about here? You know, what about our own institution? And that's what I was very proud of in the creation of that presidential task force report, which was now available to the public, that we actually got something done. It was very positive. for our university. And again, it came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, really pushing Americans to look at ourselves in the mirror, as President Jimmy Carter once said, rather than always just assuming that we're number one, we're the best. And so anyway, that I could go on forever and ever. You have to kind of cut me off.
All right, thank you so much. I definitely think that contributions like that are extremely important. I'm a big history person, so I can definitely attest to the fact that, it's important. It's nice to see that our people, Latinx people, are, advancing to catch up as well. The interview, we wanted to be focused on Hispanic, like the experience of Hispanic veterans. In this case, I assume that, as you know, it's important to also record those histories and make sure that we're represented within the veteran community. So just to get some background information, can you tell us a bit more about where you're from? What were your experiences as a kid, growing adult? Can you tell us how you got into the military? Just any background info that you would like to share.
Yeah, so I was born in 1964 in Norfolk, Virginia. My father was on active duty in the U.S. Navy. He met my mother actually when she was in high school on the other side of the country in Bremerton, Washington. Now, Bremerton is a federal shipyard town. And I grew up mainly in Bremerton until my parents divorced. And Bremerton is the home port of much of the U.S. nuclear submarine fleet. When I was growing up, we were the home port to the USS Enterprise, the USS Nimitz, which at that point for decades were the most powerful warships in the world. They're nuclear powered. And where the neighborhoods I grew up, Victoria and Elizabeth, everyone had been in the military. And I'm not speaking metaphorically, I mean everyone. And so I grew up around a lot of World War II veterans, a lot of Korean War, a lot of Vietnam. And I was coming of age, not really coming of age, but I was a kid as the Vietnam War was kind of winding down. And there was, so I grew up with a lot of stories of tragedy. Because it's one thing to be, a military person, to be a lot of people now, because our military is relatively small, sometimes will be the only person on their block, to be in the military. But where I grew up, everyone was either in the military, had been in the military, or like my sister today, for example, she is a GS-14 in the civil service, and she does billets or assignments for the U.S. Navy. So everyone is connected to the military in one way or the other. In Bremerton, it's still pretty much the same situation. So I grew up with a lot of stories about war. In fact, war was all we knew. And in terms of my heritage, as a Latino, Mexican American, Chicano, what we know of our indigenous side is that our people were part of what's known by historians, you may have read about this, as the Gran Chichimecha alliance against the European invaders in the 1500s and 1600s. Our people were the Guamares, and we fought with a number of different indigenous nations, including the Zacatecos. After the Aztecs were defeated by the European invaders, our people were up next. And we fought nearly a century-long war. It was one of the most brutal wars in modern history. We eventually were pushed into what's now San Luis Potosí, Mexico, and that's where my father's people were from. And then during now we're going to fast forward now a few centuries to 1914. Our family was heavily involved in the Mexican Revolution. My grandfather fought in the Revolution. Just about everyone, male or female, fought in the Mexican Revolution. It is one of the most bloodiest revolutions in modern history. Over 1 million people were killed. My family was caught on the wrong side of the revolution at a certain point. Revolutions, like the American Revolution or the Cuban Revolution or any revolution, sides switch sometimes very quickly. So from my understanding, my grandfather and his people, my ancestors were caught on the wrong side. They actually had to flee to the United States one evening in 1914. I learned shortly as a historian that they actually had to flee Mexico at the same point that the U.S. sent an invasion force into through the port of Veracruz, supposedly to secure American oil fields. By the time of the Mexican Revolution, U.S. Americans owned about 25% of Mexican industry and agriculture. And so, I grew up with those stories. My father was a military veteran himself. He actually was well, let me tell you one other story, then I'll tell you this other one. So my father really emphasized the importance of chores, of work. And so when we got home from school, the first thing we had to do was look at my father's chore list. And my father worked in the federal shipyard. He worked as a boiler maker. He was a boiler plant operator, providing power to the entire shipyard. When ships came in, they were retrofitted or fixed or updated, et cetera, et cetera. So my father had this chore list for us. And the key was to do all your chores, whether it was, chopping wood, pulling weeds, painting, digging a ditch or breaking rocks or whatever the case may be. And when you finished the chores and my father came home from work, sometimes he pulled double shifts in the shipyard because it worked 24/7. But when he did come home during the daytime, he would say, boy, have you done your chores? That's how Chicano fathers spoke to their kids' sons back then. Boy, it was wasn't considered a pejorative term. But and the key for me, and I learned this as I was growing up, was to tell my father I'd finished my chores, but I hadn't really finished my chores. Because the lesson my father was trying to teach me was that our work is never done here. And so I couldn't go up to him and say, oh, I finished my chores, Dad, now can I go play baseball? That was not, So my father, the last chore he would give me when I'd finished all the other chores would be to go across the street, kitty corner from my house on 8th Street in Bremerton, Washington, was what we used to call back in the day, I'm kind of ashamed of this, but we did call it an old folks home. And it was, in retrospect, it was a retirement home, and there were many World War I veterans. That's kind of how old I am, because I'm just old enough to, as a young boy, because my father would send me across the street and he'd say, go talk to the old timers. And so that was a chore. And I would sit and I would listen to them tell their stories. And some of them told stories about World War I, and it was really incredible. I took it for granted as a kid. But I'll tell you one more story about when I was in kindergarten, my first beginning of an understanding of what it meant to be part of this veterans community. And this is kind of a disturbing story, so I apologize in advance. But my father taught me how to walk to school. Back then, most young people walked, and we didn't have a car growing up. And so I had to walk about 1.5 miles to get to my elementary school. So about a week before kindergarten started, my father took me on the, 2 or 3 times, took me on the route on how I would walk to school. And because my town of Bremerton was a shipyard town, there was a lot of violence. I grew up in a gun culture. There was a lot of, there was police violence. There was, random violence. There was a lot of veterans who had trauma from the war. And there were a lot of drugs. Every time we go to war, you'll see that there's a major drug problem that coincides with that war. And Vietnam was no different. There was a major heroin problem in Bremerton as I was growing up. So as my father was walking me to school and showing me how I would, behave myself on the way to school, he would give me certain warnings. He would say, don't stop next to this house. It's a drug house. Don't stop in this corner. There's violence that's happened here. Just keep, double time. It's a military term, double time boy through the street. The last corner that we turned to where I could actually see Naval Avenue Elementary School, where I was going to start kindergarten, there's a house in the corner. And my father said, boy, it's very important that when you approach this house, you keep walking, you keep your head down, you're very close to the school at this point. You keep your eyes on the prize, you keep going, and you don't stop for anything. He said that some mornings there's going to be an older man who's going to run out in the porch and he's going to start shouting at you. He's going to yell at you. He's going to curse at you. You are not to look at him. You are not to engage with him. You are to keep your head down and keep going, which was kind of unusual advice back then, because back then we were supposed to always acknowledge our elders. If an elder spoke to you, you wouldn't look them in the eye. You would look kind of midsection and say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. But for this person, I was to keep my head down and keep walking straight. My father said, he'll come out and he'll just start yelling. And so my father kind of warned me. Well, school started. And I, the first 2 or 3 months, I was very proud of my ability to walk to school by myself. And, kindergarten was going pretty well. One morning I headed up my morning walk. And my memory is I was almost even with this house. And this older gentleman just came out on the porch and just started shouting and cursing at me. And to this day, I can kind of remember the fear and just but really the shock more than anything else. I mean, I'd seen cursing before. I mean, in a shipyard town, that's just our way of life, but not this anger and just rage. But my father told me that the man would actually stay on his porch, but just to keep walking. And in fact, he did, but he just shouted and yelled, and it was really disturbing to me. And I don't think I ever even told my father that story until many years later. And it happened maybe once or twice the rest of the year that he would come out shouting and screaming. But then he either moved the following year when I went into first grade, he passed away, I don't know. But when my father told me, when he gave me the directions on how to walk past this house, he made a reference. And he said, this man is very angry. He has a reason to be angry. He was in the 106th during World War II. And that was it. And so as a little kid, you kind of ask questions. And I think one time I may have asked my father, well, what was 106? And he's like, I don't want to talk about it. And so we moved on to another thing. And then years later, I was reading this book and in high school as a senior in English, and the book described the experiences of 2 American prisoners of war in Nazi Germany. And I asked my teacher, because the experiences seemed very familiar. And you have to remember, again, I grew up in a culture where everyone is talking about war. And people talked about things like the Malmedy massacre, where Nazi soldiers murdered American soldiers. They talked about some of them had liberated Nazi death camps during World War II. Some of them had talked about being overrun by Chinese soldiers in Korea. Others talked about just the terrible situations of Vietnam. There was always kind of a hush when certain things came up. One of them was the Bataan Death March, because I was in a Navy town. There was a fair number of veterans who either had known about the Death March when the Japanese Army took over the Philippines, or had friends who had died during that horrific experience. But there's another experience that people would talk about, and occasionally they would talk about what had happened to the 106. Well, what had happened to them was that during World War II, the very closing months of the war, the Nazis launched their last great offensive, and they got all their tanks, all their airplanes, everything they had left to try to drive the Allies back to the Atlantic Ocean, right, out of France, out of Belgium. And that was called, the American historians call that the Battle of the Bulge. So the 106th was an American infantry division that was in the front of the American forces, very poorly led, very poorly armed. and they were just wiped out by the Nazis. I mean, they lost thousands of men, and many who survived actually were taken as prisoners of war. They were taken on a troop train to Dresden, Germany, after the Germans captured them. And on the way, the Allies mistook the troop train. They mistook the train. The train had markings that were carrying prisoners of war. And for some reason, the Allied planes didn't understand the markings or didn't see them, so they bombed the train. So hundreds of young POWs were killed on the train. And then they got to Dresden, Germany. And about, I think, you can check me on this, either a few weeks later or maybe a couple months later, the Allies launched really the biggest firebombing up to that point in World War II. And they completely wiped out Dresden, Germany. And so a lot of the POWs were killed in that firebombing. But the ones who survived were forced by the Germans to do burial detail. And what they had to do was they literally had to scrape human remains, because this was a firebombing and people were incinerated. And so these American and British POWs had to scrape human remains off of the sides of buildings, literally. They had to dispose of bodies. They set up funeral piers to burn people hundreds at a time. And this man had been a part of that. And so when I was a senior, I was reading this book, and I said, Mr. Bidwell, he was a Navy veteran. All of our teachers were military veterans. I said, Mr. Bidwell, what unit was this man in this book? And he said, oh, he was in the 106th. And suddenly I just got chills. I mean, and the book was Slaughterhouse-Five, and by Kurt Vonnegut. To me, still one of the most magnificent books as a military veteran I've ever read. But Kurt Vonnegut was trying to explain why these men came back and were just devastated. And the point he was trying to make was, politicians start wars, but they cannot end them. And a war never really ends until the last civilians or military people involved in it have passed away. And even then, trauma can be passed down, et cetera, et cetera. So I apologize. I kind of gave you a long-winded story, but that I wanted to share with you, years before I was in the military myself, this was part of our culture.
It's a great story. Thank you for enlightening us. I have never heard a story like that, so this is really all new content. I greatly appreciate it. Do you have a question, or can I keep going?
No, you can.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So now that we have some background on your experiences as a kid, I think it's interesting. So far, we've interviewed people that didn't really have a tie to the military before enlisting. So it's really it's enlightening to see how these experiences might have had an impact on your personal experience. So is there anything that you want to highlight about your personal experience in the military? How old were you when you first started, or any beginning experiences that you want to share with us?
But when I was a junior in high school, I took a pre-SAT test, and I don't know if they still have those, but I scored pretty well, and I started getting college catalogs. Well, the problem was, my people didn't go to college. We didn't go to school. We had no connection to any university. And so I remember taking a stack of those to my counselor in high school. And I said, sir, my parents can't really help me apply to college, but, it looks interesting. I was so naive back then. This is so embarrassing for me to even share with you, that I thought, because I played football in high school, and I thought, I got a catalog from Notre Dame University. It was one of the universities that kind of sticks out of my mind. And I thought, man, maybe I can go play football there. It was so ridiculous, so ludicrous. I could never have played football at Notre Dame University. But be that as it may, I brought these catalogs to my high school. The counselor looked at them and said, well, Paul, college isn't for everyone. Wasn't your father in the Marines? I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I think that's what you should do, because college isn't for everyone. And I wanted to share that because that still goes on in a lot of schools in this country. And a lot of young Hispanic, Latino youth are led, instead of being officers in the military and going to college and becoming officers, or really having more of a choice, we're kind of led into the military. Now, for me, in retrospect, that's how I paid for college. And so positive. Negative, I was in combat zone, so I could have been killed, may have went to college, right? But anyway, back to when I was 18. So when I was 18, I went into the military. I was kind of fast-tracked because my father, I mentioned, was a veteran. He was recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. He didn't go, and hence I'm here to talk with you now. And it's interesting though, I would ask him, I'd say, Dad, why didn't you go? Because he was about 20, I think. He was in between Marines and the Navy. He had incredible communication skills. And I'd ask him, Dad, why didn't you go take part in this thing? And he said, well, it didn't seem like they had a good plan B. And he said, it just didn't seem like a good operation. And I kind of laugh with him about that because I'm like, well, Dad, could you have known that back then? I mean, that's true. It's true. But that's something you can learn from the History Channel, that there was no plan B for the Bay of Pigs invasion. But anyway, be that as it may, my father told me something before I went to boot camp, which was very important for me, which may have saved my life. And he used the experiences he had in the military. And the last thing he told me before I left for boot camp in Fort Dix, New Jersey, in the Christmas of 1982, was, boy, don't trust officers, they'll get you killed. And that advice I used when I was in Central America more than once. But I went to Fort Dix in basic training over the winter of 1982. We were there over Christmas. And the toughest thing about boot camp was the cold. I'd never been in such cold. It snowed the whole time. It froze. A lot of guys got frostbite. Back then, I was still in the all-male military. There were women, but we were in different units, segregated. And it was just so cold. And our drill instructors were, the head drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Rumpf, I'll never forget him, really good drill instructor. But he had been an interrogator in Vietnam. That was his MOS, he was psychological operations. He was an African-American gentleman. My assistant drill sergeant, his surname was Rodriguez. He was Puerto Rican. I served with a lot of Hispanic, a lot of Latino men throughout my service. Some of them were citizens like myself. Others were not. We didn't use the term undocumented back then, but we knew that there were a lot of men in our various units, especially the further south you got, who are not U.S. citizens. And that's something I think that should be highlighted, that even during World War I, and I've given this lecture before, when the U.S. took control of Puerto Rico, essentially to grant a citizenship to the people of that island, it was kind of an unspoken thing that, well, okay, we'll grant you kind of provisional citizenship, but we can't get enough Anglos to fight World War I, so we need you to come and fight. And so Puerto Ricans enrolled in very large numbers to serve during World War I. And that's pretty much, that's true with Mexican Americans in World War I, World War II, and Dominicans, and really all the way up through Vietnam. So anyway, in boot camp, I made it through. One day there was a film. It was interesting. I remember this like it was yesterday. They showed a film. They marched us into an auditorium. We saw this film about guys jumping out of airplanes. And it was very dramatic, and it was very kind of romantic in the sense that these guys, these paratroopers, which I grew up knowing about, the 82nd Airborne Division, were the most popular guys in the block according to this film. It was, in retrospect, it was kind of a propaganda film, and it was a recruitment film to try to get guys to sign up to go to jump school. And we watched this film about guys jumping out of airplanes, and where everyone loved them and everything like that. And I'm sure there was some sex involved somewhere. There always is. And at the end of the film, the man who showed the film asked for volunteers. He said, I'm looking for volunteers of guys who will volunteer to go to jump school to be a paratrooper at Fort Benning, Georgia. And man, I raised my hand so quickly, y'all. I was like, I want to go there. It sounds so cool, man. Yeah. And I looked around me, I noticed no one else had raised their hands. And I was like, oh, what's wrong with these people? Don't they understand where it's at? I remember after that, my assistant DI Rodriguez came up to me. He was a sergeant. He said, Ortiz, you've got to be the dumbest moron I've ever known in my entire life. He said, don't you know better than to volunteer in this man's army? He said, in the future, I better not catch you volunteering unless I tell you to volunteer. Because when you volunteer in this man's army, chances are you're going to get killed, right? So anyway, I went on to jump school. And because I grew up in a gun culture, I was kind of fast-tracked. I was in the 82nd Airborne for a little over a year. And it's such an amazing experience. I could talk all day about it. But I ended up getting deployed to Central America in the mid-'80s because the U.S. was really looking to ramp up its involvement in Central America. And we were already heavily involved. We had special forces all over the region. So did the British, so did the Israelis, so did the French. And we were all trying to do the same thing. We were trying to get more influence of countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, et cetera, et cetera. I was actually stationed in what was known then as the Panama Canal Zone. The U.S. controlled that zone and had controlled it. We created a phony revolution to actually get that chunk of land from Colombia originally to build a canal, back at the turn of the century. So I was stationed at Fort Davis. I was in U.S. 7th Special Forces. And in the region, I mainly worked on my own. I was a fixer. I was a communicator. I was a combat radio operator. And so I would go and reestablish communications, especially with units that had lost them, especially on the border between Honduras and Nicaragua, and some other place, and Colombia too. I was sent to Colombia several times. I also trained people in pistol techniques because I mentioned, if you look at the childhood pictures of me, and Deborah has some of these, every picture that I have survived from my childhood, I'm carrying a toy pistol of some kind. And then the later pictures of me, I had real guns, and so that's what I did really in the time I was in Central America. And it was really, it was very, very, very stressful because I served in multiple combat zones. I was never in a big unit and there was no sense of safety. What I mean by this is that I would be sent out on missions where I would be told, quite frankly and honestly, and I appreciated the candor, believe me, but I'd be told, Ortiz, you leave your dog tags in the barracks. If you get caught, we don't know you. Sorry, but I was told very early on when I went to Central America, this is not, Ortiz, this is not like the movies. We do leave people behind. If you get caught by the Marxist guerrillas or paramilitaries, whoever, sorry about that. We're not going to send anyone after you. And so right away, I knew that in a lot of cases, I'd be on my own. Because I worked by myself largely, I had the chance to see things I think that most people in the military don't see if you're in a big unit. One of the things I saw was a lot of protests against U.S. military involvement in Central America. The first time that I choppered into what was in Palmarola Air Force Base, which is like a staging ground in Honduras, the base was surrounded by these people who are obviously quite poor, peasant farmers, I believe, who were protesting, who had picket signs, who were saying, Yankee, go home. We don't want you here. And, as a 19 or 20-year-old soldier, I probably should have been more mature. I probably should have thought more, but I was so kind of brainwashed by my country to believe that, well, anything we did had to be good. It had to be for a good reason. I didn't know back then the kind of power that the Pentagon has over the American political system. And after that, I was just too busy to really think much, to process much. And so Deborah Hendricks has recently interviewed me. I mean, this is a typical story. So one night I got back from a mission and I got a call, and the sergeant of the guard bangs on my door because we didn't have phones back then in our barracks. There were no cell phones, believe it or not. And so there was one phone at the barracks. The sergeant of the guard was on the phone. He goes, "Ortiz, you really had it now. There's the executive officer of U.S. Southern Command is on the phone." And I'm thinking, well, damn, this guy's like a major general. And so I'm thinking, am I going to get court-martialed, or, because you never were sure when you're in that situation like we were in Central America. You're not sure if they're going to give you a medal or if they're going to court-martial, and you're always kind of walking the line. So anyway, I get on the phone. "Yes, sir." "Is this Sergeant Ortiz?" "Yes, sir, speaking." He said, "Son, we have sent a U.S. combat aviation battalion to the highlands of Colombia near Tolima, or in Tolima, and we have completely lost communications with them. Do you know what that means?" And I thought about it for a moment. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, a combat aviation battalion, that's a few dozen helicopters. That's hundreds of men. And I'm thinking, this guy has just told me that they've lost a combat aviation battalion near Tolima, which is a mountainous part of Colombia. And I said something like, well, yes, sir, because I had no idea. And the next thing was, he said, "Son, can you reestablish communications between us and my battalion?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I can do that." And he said, "Your reputation is that you're the best radio operator in this region, and we need you to do this. And the lives of these men depend upon it." And so I said, "Yes, sir." Now, I had no idea whether or not I could reestablish communication, but I was young, I was cocky, I was very arrogant, and I was with a lot of really good guys, a lot of good communicators. And so we felt we could do anything. And so I said, well, sir, give me a few hours. We'll drive over tomorrow morning to Panama City. That's where Southcom was based. And he said, "I have a chopper waiting for you right now." I'm like, "You do?" Looked down the courtyard. There was a chopper there. And so I said, "I'm going to need 3 men." And so he said, "Get your men together and, meet me." I think it was like 400 hours or something. And so we choppered over, and we're sitting in a room. And as best as I can recall, Victoria and Elizabeth, and this is where the memory is tricky, but in my mind, the room is kind of like the war room in, I don't know if either of you have seen that movie, Dr. Strangelove. It's kind of like it reminds me in my memory, I know this can't be true, but I'm thinking it's kind of like the war room in Dr. Strangelove. And so these generals and colonels and stuff are going around, and they started asking me these questions. I just arrived with my 3 guys, and they said, "Sergeant Ortiz, can you explain to us what type of communication problems you'd have if if there was thick ash that blocked your antenna from the sun or from the atmosphere?" And they ran me through a bunch of different questions and scenarios. They said, what would happen if there had been a massive explosion, there was a lot of debris? How would that impact communications? And I said, well, yes, sir, it would, pretty profoundly. Well, how would you deal with that? Okay, well, here's some ideas on how you would deal with that. And then one of the questions, the word radioactive was used. Well, what would happen if this was partially radioactive debris? And I thought in my mind, I didn't say anything out loud, but I thought, my God, did these guys start a nuclear war in Colombia? And I finally said, well, sir, I really need to know exactly what happened. And they told me that the previous evening, very early in the morning or late in the evening, you can check me on this, a volcano had erupted, and between 20 and 45,000 people were killed almost instantly by the lava flow of the volcano. And that this is what this combat aviation battalion had been deployed to Lima to lead the U.S. Army's effort at disaster relief. Okay, the Red Cross obviously would be there, and other humanitarian agencies would be there. But it was the 173rd. It's on that citation that's in Deborah's office. I think it was the 173rd Combat Aviation Battalion. And so they said, what are you going to need to reestablish communications with them, because they're running the disaster relief, and this is blankets and food and everything you can imagine. And so I started ordering things. I said, well, I assumed there wasn't any electrical power in the area that we're going to be. So I said, I'm going to need a few pallets of lithium batteries. I'm going to need a whole range of radios, UHF, VHF, high frequency, low frequency, everything pretty much. And it was the first time in my life I felt that I could pretty much call the shots, actually. And these are officers, remember. I remember at a certain point, this one lower ranking officer, he may have been a lieutenant colonel, he stopped me and he said, Ortiz, you don't have the power to do that. You can't make all these demands. And this general looked at him and cut him off and said, he gets everything he needs, everything he asked for, because that's what we need to get the communications back with our men. And so the guy kind of got shut up, and I just kind of sat there and I was like, wow, this is, anyway, we choppered into Lima from Panama City. We took a Chinook helicopter. That's my memory, the best as I can remember. We had a lot of gear. And so we offloaded. We were awake pretty much, or I was awake the whole week. People asked me how I do that or how I did that. Well, I was young back then. We had to keep communications around the clock. We reestablished communications very quickly once we got there. It may say that on the citation, I can't remember. My memory is we reestablished communications in about 2 to 3 hours. And we did it with an ultra high frequency antenna. It was a mobile antenna back then. UHF is a very high band. Back then, we did a formula as radio operators. We had access to 5 geocentric satellites that were orbiting the Earth. If you found that satellite, you did the computation, you bounce the signal off that satellite, and you could communicate pretty much anywhere in the world. It was impacted by atmospheric conditions, and so the volcano going up, erupting, did impact our communications. And so we set up high frequency, we set up VHF, which is more of a quick, or it's more of a short range setup. We had antennas all over the place. And it was really one of the most amazing experiences of my entire life to get this operation up and running again. And this feeling that we were actually doing something good. We weren't attacking anyone, we weren't shooting at anyone, we weren't training someone how to shoot other people, and which was most of what I'd done in Central America. But it was really exhausting. There had been fire, the base had been fired at, it come under fire at a certain point. But that was just kind of the status quo. I remember at the end of the 7th day, when we were told the mission was over and would transition into more of a kind of a disaster relief mission, because everyone who had been rescued had been rescued. And there were some really powerful clips you can still see on YouTube, I'm sure, of children who were rescued by helicopters and things like that. Now, I was on the other side of that mountain, and so I didn't see that. The pilots were so grateful, they offered to take us over and do a flyover to see what had happened in the town of Armero, but I didn't go. because it's hard to explain, Victoria and Elizabeth, but when so many people are killed at one time, and I think the estimates now anywhere from like 25 to 35,000 people were killed in that doomed town. You can almost feel the trauma, the agony, the spirits of the people that have been killed in such a horrific way. And so I didn't really feel the need to do a flyover to see that physically. We were too busy running the disaster relief mission on the other side of the range there. And so it was very intense. And I remember being told at the end of 7 days the mission is being transitioned now. Sergeant Ortiz, your men are free to go back to your unit, back to Special Forces, or you can stay with us. We'd love to have you with us. Well, I knew that was the case because these guys they went to this place, they had no idea where they were going, and they took the wrong radios. They took radios that never could have communicated back to Panama City. So we did do some workshops when we were there. We said, y'all, VHF does not communicate from the Colombian mountains back to Panama City. You have to take other radio gear, right? I think they knew that, but they had made a mistake or something. I don't know. But it's typical in U.S. military history, y'all. This is just FYI. Most big battles are lost not because of even arms and ammunition. They're lost because of poor communication. So anyway, when I was asked if we would wanted to extend our stay with the Combat Aviation Battalion, I said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going back home. And at that point, what people told me was that I actually collapsed on a pallet that once had lithium batteries on it. And the guys just kind of put me on the pallet, secured me, loaded me on the helicopter. And the next thing I remember, I was back in Panama City. And a couple of the guys said, Paul, we thought you'd had a stroke because you just collapsed. I just remember it was almost like passing out. I was so tired. But by the end of my tour of duty in Central America, I remember things were just really in a bad situation in Central America. There was a lot of, the civil wars were raging. The U.S. was on the wrong side generally. We were training people who were some of them were just, the worst people. You wouldn't even want, your family to have anything to do with them. Some of these were just very bad people. It was all done under a lot of it was supposedly anti-communism. I don't think that's true. I think that anti-communism has just become an excuse so many times in American history to just invade, to take people's resources, and then you claim they were communists. And so they should have lost those resources. I remember by the last night, I'll tell you a couple of stories and I'll see if you have any other questions. But the last night I was in Central America, and I always carried a sidearm with me. And when you're in a war zone for that long a period of time, and the borders aren't drawn clearly, right? Everyone is suspicious. And I actually had a death threat in my life. The last night I was in country in Panama, the Panama Canal Zone. I made it out. I remember, but the death threat was from my own guys in another unit. And to this day, I don't know why they threatened to kill me. I don't know if they thought I had information that could compromise them or what. But I remember doing my out processing physical as I left the country, and the doctor, who was an officer, examined me. And I was not in good shape. I had a nervous twitch all over my face. I really couldn't close my eyes. And he just kind of looked at me. He said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Sir, I can't sleep." I said, even when I always slept with a pistol under my pillow. I couldn't sleep any other way. And he just said, "You're just not in good shape, young man." He said, what you need is you just need to go home and sleep for about 2 or 3 months and just go and lay down. And I thought, man, I can't do that. What I was led to do, though, was by the end of my service in Central America, it really pushed me into becoming a historian, because I've been told so many things when we were deployed to Central America about the U.S., why we were there. And then by the end of it, I realized, wow, a lot of this is, I've just been lied to. And a lot of it was people in Panama and Colombia and other parts who told me, why are you here? They would ask me, why can't, one of them said, why can't the U.S. keep its hands off of us in Honduras? And by the time I finished, I thought, well, yeah, I mean, the U.S. is all over Honduras, everywhere. Every town you could go to away from the border, there would be people from the U.S., DEA, CIA, military, corporate people. And yet this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And I began to understand the connections between, military occupation and poverty. And so that pushed me. I said, by God, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And that's really why I became a historian.
Those are amazing stories. Thank you so much for sharing. It's really nice to gain some insight on how experiences are. Usually, I've personally heard a lot of stories about the people, like the time people have served in the country. I do have a lot of friends and family who have taken position as teachers in the military bases and towns as well. So that's kind of like the only experience and, I don't know, knowledge I have on veterans. So it's really nice to get insight on like outside experiences. Just to close up and just to get some last like thoughts on about you. Would you say that there's anything, any reflections that you have on your time, or well, what would you say is the impact of Hispanics in the military now that you have served yourself? What do you think is our role in the military, and how we have evolved and our role has evolved in the military?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. For us, military service is often our main claim to citizenship. And what I mean by this is that, if you think of World War II or Korea, or even my father's era of Korea and Vietnam, and my uncles and great uncles, for them, and I guess for me as a kid, we didn't have much. We didn't have, land. We had ancestors who had land, and then it was taken from them. And so being in the military was our main claim to citizenship in this country. And if you go to any Hispanic community, Mexican American community, Puerto Rican, Dominican that I know of, veterans serve a certain role in that community. But we had to fight to gain any sense of equity or equality within the military. And so, especially for Latino veterans, especially the Latino community writ large, the experience of coming home from World War II and still suffering discrimination, like my father's generation, they and his uncles, they had signs in Texas that said, no Negroes, no Mexicans, or no dogs allowed. And that was a pretty typical sign. And these guys were coming back from Guadalcanal, the Pacific, like my great uncle Joe. They came back from Europe, they came back from Asia, they just fought for their country. And you want them to come back to a situation where they go back to being third-class citizens. Well, some of them compromised, but many others did not. And so in your class, it's very important that you study an organization called the American GI Forum, if you haven't already come across that, because that became one of the main Latino civil rights organizations founded by veterans of World War II. And the spark that led to the founding of the GI Forum was that, well, a few things. One is that the Anglo veterans associations like the VFW, the American Legion, would not allow us in. And so we do what we do best as a people. We look after each other, for our young people, the good of our elders. And so we formed the American GI Forum. And it became a powerful motive background force behind the modern Latino civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. I think for me, if you ask me, what responsibility do we have as Latinos in terms of the military? I just gave the Hispanic Heritage keynote for the Orlando Veterans Administration. And there were hundreds of people on the call. Not all of them, but many of them were Latino veterans or Latinos within the VA, counselors, occupational therapists, et cetera, et cetera. And this question actually came up. And I said, well, I'm very proud of the fact that we have a much more cosmopolitan understanding, especially of the Americas, than many of our Anglo friends. When I say Anglo, that means white. Where I grew up, that was the term white. And so I think it's really up to us to kind of explain to people that when they talk about, when they say things like, hey, let's go bring democracy to Colombia or to Honduras or even Cuba, that's not our role. Our role is to worry about democracy here. And their role in those countries is to worry about how they want to govern themselves there. Should we be on the side of liberty and equality? Yes, we should always be on that side. But I just have lived this experience. I grew up hearing this experience, and I know this, my brother-in-law just retired from the Navy, was deployed to Afghanistan twice. It's just that whenever we decide that we're going to bring democracy to people, it ends up in a very bad situation, whether you talk about Iraq or Afghanistan, even what's going on now in the Gaza Strip, in the Middle East. And so I think we do have a responsibility of remembering, our history and trying to share with people around us that, yes, do I believe in the military, that the U.S. should have a military? Yes, for defensive purposes. Do I think the Pentagon budget should be so large? No, it should be, I think it should be cut like by 4/5. It's just obscene to me. And I'll editorialize as a military veteran who has seen a lot of waste in the Pentagon. But see, the funny thing is the waste isn't in the VA hospital. It isn't in the retirement benefits for retired military, because they really still don't get that much. The waste is in like the F-35 jet. The waste is in nuclear weapons. The waste is in these huge aircraft carriers are still building, which really were outmoded in the 1950s. You need so much to protect a modern aircraft carrier from one drone attack. It's billions of dollars. Like when I was in, the joke was a screwdriver in the US military cost $700. Now that was in 1984. Think about that. And and many of us grew up in neighborhoods, like I mentioned, we didn't have a car where I grew up. Our schools were always underfunded. They'd say, well, there's just not enough money to make sure kids don't go to bed hungry at night. And then in the military, you find out, well, this is where the money is going. It's not going to the troops, the soldiers, the airmen, et cetera, et cetera. It goes to these weapons systems. And so the last thing I'll say on that there is I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. It's a very old veterans organization, and we advocate for, we're a service organization for veterans first and foremost, but we also work with youth to try to let them know, if you want to go in the military, that's great, but there are other options. And so I chair our Veterans for Peace in Gainesville, our scholarship committee. And every year we give 3 to 4 scholarships, $1,500 each, to area youth who make a statement in support of nonviolence and peaceful ways of solving conflicts or problems. And for me, that's very important, because getting back to the beginning of my story, I wasn't given that option. The option that we were given when I was a kid was you just fight it out. If there's something wrong, you fight. There's different ways of fighting. There's a way of fighting that you use your head. And you don't risk your life or my life. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to model in Veterans for Peace is, and we feel as military veterans, we have a special responsibility to communicate to people, what is war like? And the last thing I'll say is, even what's happening in Gaza now, I've seen on Facebook people saying things like, well, the Israelis have the right to retaliate. Well, okay, that may be true, but I try to share with people, have you ever been to a village that's been hit by an airstrike? Have you ever seen a person killed? Have you ever seen a person die prematurely? Well, I have. And so it's my responsibility to share with you that your sentiments are really not helping things. In fact, they're making things much, much worse. But anyway, I feel like I can blabber on forever, but you asked really good questions. I apologize for rambling different points, but hopefully some of this has been useful.
Yes, of course. I mean, everything you've told us is amazing, and I love that you were able to share a lot, information with just one question. It was amazing because like it kind of builds on. It's great. Yeah. So, do you have any questions?
I just wanted to say, like, it was really interesting how, while like you did serve in Central America, that you were able to really come back and reflect on like what had been done there and kind of like make your own like decisions and like opinions on what was being done there without like, just the influence of like the tunnel vision of the military. So I just think that was like really interesting because I feel like that's not talked about very often.
Well, and it took a while. I think, to be honest, you process experiences, right? And it doesn't come to you all at once. So it did take a while. But it's funny you mentioned TV, because to process that experience, I actually had to kind of turn away from. I remember the first Memorial Day I was back home, there was some politician, it could have been the president, I don't remember, who talked about, the meaning of military service or something like that. I wanted to pick up the TV and throw it out the window because I had never heard such nonsense in my entire life. I realized this is when I began as a young man in my early 20s to realize that patriotism is often used against us. It's used to manipulate us. That's how white nationalism, grew in this country so poisonously. So instead of throwing the TV out the window, which would have got me evicted from my apartment, I actually took the TV to the local Salvation Army. And I said, I've had it with this. I don't want to watch this anymore. This is a bunch of propaganda. And instead, I focused on my studies. And I was actually in Olympic Community College. I got my Associate of Arts. But I had to kind of cut myself off from that, Elizabeth, to kind of understand what my experiences were. Because everyone wanted to tell me, this is a funny thing, when I got home, they would say things like, well, thank you for fighting the communists there so we don't have to fight them here. And I warn people now, in fact, I had a man come up to me in an airport a few years ago, and he was so upset. I was wearing a veteran's cap. And he said, well, you're a veteran. You can understand why I'm so upset. He said, I went up to a group of young men in military uniform. And I said, thank you for fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them here. And they told me to F off. And it was a businessman type. And he said, can you explain, why? I was just trying to be, supportive and patriotic. And I said, sir, let me be blunt with you. What you just told those young men was gravely insulting to them. They're risking their lives. And so, but what you told them was, instead of just thanking them, you said, essentially, thank you for being stupid over there so I don't have to face the dangers here. And so I'm going to live my privileged life here in my gated community, but you go and put your life in jeopardy and your life, your comrades in jeopardy, so that I can just kind of, he said, well, I didn't mean that. I said, but see, that's what you really said. And so in many occasions, but see, it took me years, Elizabeth and Victoria, to really kind of understand and process all these things. But because when I got home, people would say things like, well, thank you for fighting communism there, so we don't have to deal with it here. And I was like, y'all have no idea what you're talking about, really. And I'll say immigration. Here's and I promise to be the last things. I have a meeting at 12:30, but my Anglo friends, Victoria and Elizabeth, would tell me, I got back in 1987, Paul, you were just down there. Why are so many Guatemalans and Hondurans and Salvadorans in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, Fresno, et cetera, why are they coming here in waves? And I would look at these people and I would say, you don't know why? because we've helped make their region unlivable. You know, once you bomb someone's crops, they can't like replow the field and start over again. It's over. And so I said, you know, that's what we're doing. I said, our own government is making it impossible for these people to live in their home villages or towns. Well, why do they come here? Why don't they go someplace else? Well, where else do you want them to go? You know, we've just turned their country into a desert. Some of them do go to Mexico, but Mexico it only has such an economy. They have to go elsewhere. I mean, now Latinos are going all over the world. Some of them are actually in the Philippines. Some of them are in the Middle East. Some of them are in Europe, you know. But I guess that was part of my processing, Elizabeth, getting back to your question, was getting these ridiculous questions. And then I realized they weren't ridiculous. I realized that if you don't know, if no one's taught you, you'll just think that, well, you know, my maid and my cleaner and my cook are all from Honduras because they just love America, you know. And if you don't know any better, that's what you will come up with. And being in the military, I'm grateful for that. Gave me the perspective to be able to tell people point blank, you know, this is why people have to move. And if you didn't mess with them, they wouldn't move so much. And then you'd have much less to complain about whenever you get into trouble and you want to blame Mexican Americans especially for your troubles. Anyway, now I'm starting to editorialize again. But it's been a pleasure. Let me know if there's anything else I can do. You have my contact information. I'm really excited to see what your class comes up with. And again, thank you for doing this really important work.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was an amazing interview. You're a great speaker. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria Elizabeth. All right. I appreciate you. You're great interviewers. So keep up the great work and good luck in the class.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye now.